So, good evening, everybody. Welcome to the Grimm Auditorium and welcome to the second Mosse lecture in this winter term, where we deal with the cultural and political importance of vocal authenticity and the advanced technology to simulate but also to conceal it. At the core of our interest are human voices as well as technical sounds, and one aspect we want to learn more about tonight is what those sounds, what differences in pronunciation, purity, and volume reveal involuntarily, how the aesthetic sensibility for those minute distinctions can be trained, and most of all, what kind of evidence can be derived from it in lawsuits and police investigations. Over the last decades, critical forensics has become an emerging juridical and conceptual field situated at the juncture of security studies, art, and architecture. In the beginning, this field owed its rapid expansion to the new visibilities provided by cell phone footage and its easy accessibility through digital platforms and clouds. In the meantime, however, the field has expanded and new audibility enhancements have gained equal relevance for the politics of juridical hearing, especially the situations of legal identity profiling, for instance, in asylum and immigration cases where voice and accent analysis is used to assess an individual's credibility. The discrimination of people because of the way they speak, because of their ability or disability to pronounce words and phrases properly, is pretty common and widespread among societies across the globe. And since deviances of that kind have a comic aspect too, at least in the ears of those who perceive them as strange, uncultivated, or pathological, popular entertainment culture has early begun to exploit such defects as an endless source for play and mockery. Remember, for instance, the London flower girl named Eliza Doolittle, with a stark Cockney accent, who arouses the attention of a passerby who then turns out to be a professor of phonetics, taking her as an ideal object for an ethnographic study, while at the same time displaying an overt disgust for what he considers to be a social disease. In the musical My Fair Lady, Alan J. Lerner and Frederick Loewe have created a series of hilarious scenes around Eliza taking pains to get rid of her linguistic handicap with the help of the elocutionist. The expert of phonetics is smart enough to use poetry with its repetitive structure of rhymes and alliterations as a remedy in the talking cure he designs for her. And he succeeds. After weeks of intensive instruction, Eliza, played in the musical film, as you might know, by Audrey Hepburn, stops saying the Rhine in spine, stais meinli in die Plein. The refrain has fulfilled the double task as a test phrase as well as a piece of exercise and is the basis for the flower girl's transformation from Cinderella to princess. Test words or test phrases of that type are in English called shibboleth. The term is borrowed from Hebrew and originally means car, ear or stream of grain, Weizenähre in German. But speakers of English take shibboleth to mean not what it means in Hebrew, but the way it is used in a particular story in the Old Testament of the Bible reported in the book of Judges. The respective episode describes an accent test administered by a military leader who wanted to weed out suspected enemy Ephraimites from his own men, the Gileadites. He took advantage of the difficulty those Ephraimites were known to have pronouncing the sh sound. Here, in the biblical precedent case, the test word functioned as a kind of lie detector, and the consequences were of utmost brutality. Whoever failed to say shibboleth instead of sibboleth was doomed to death. Then they took him, reads the passage from the book of Judges, and slew him at the passages of Jordan, and there fell at that time of the Ephraimites 42,000. The projects of Lawrence Abu Hamdan, a British Lebanese artist and researcher, audio forensic expert, and political activist, currently based in Dubai, I suppose, but I'm not sure, but because you changed places so often, propel the politics of the shibboleth into the field of creative and critical audio practice. Drawing on his professional skills as a musician, he explores in his project the political dimension of listening and emphasizes the importance of listening for the assignment of human rights and for jurisdiction. His forensic engagement and artistic production inspired each other mutually. Abu Hamdan was involved in oral investigations directed by Forensic Architecture, an agency situated at Goldsmiths College in London, and dealt in this context with murder cases where the noise of shots provided a measure for judging the assassin's guilt. Other cases concerned the victims of torture in Syrian prisons, where the bulk of clues consisted of audio memories. Engagements of that kind were reconsidered in his dissertation submitted at Goldsmiths in, I hope I'm right, 2016, under the title Oral Contract Investigations at the Threshold of Audibility. And they continue to be an essential bedrock for his audio documentaries, films, performances, and installations, many of which have been shown in galleries and museums across the globe. Over the last years, Lawrence Abu Hamdan has been an in-demand speaker, too, with invitations to serve as visiting professor from the University of Chicago, the New York School, and from the Hochschule für Musik at Mainz in 2022, where he held a substitute professorship of sound art composition. Those of you who visited this year's Berlin Biennale were able to see his most recent installation at Hamburger Bahnhof. The work was entitled Air Condition and presented a room-filling image, a band of images mapping the Israeli army's sonic occupation of the Lebanese airspace over a 15-year period. Among his previous installations, I'd like to mention in particular Contradiction, Speech Against Itself, commissioned by Kunsthalle St. Gallen in Switzerland in 2015, and The Voice Before the Law, presented here in Berlin in 2019. Other works of his were exhibited at the Institute of Modern Art in Brisbane, the MoMA in New York, the Centre Georges Pompidou in Paris, the Tate Modern in London, and a mosque in Muqtara in Lebanon. In tonight's talk, Lawrence Abu Hamdan will expand on his latest project in more detail and propose different categories of witnessing, evidence, and the production of truth in court, which in turn necessitate new practices of listening. His interlocutor will be Britta Lange, a colleague from the Department of Cultural Studies here at Humboldt-Universität, who herself has dealt extensively with the legal and political dimensions of voices, albeit with the emphasis on different aspects. Britta Lange earned her PhD with a thesis on the Hamburg-based company Umlauf, which traded ethnographic figures of wax. During her time as a Lise Meitner Fellow at the Austrian Academy of Sciences, she started a project on prisoners of war being used as objects for anthropological and ethnographic research. In the course of these studies, she turned public attention to the sound archives of Humboldt University, and especially to the largest collection of these archives, which consists of recordings from detainees in German prisoner of war camps produced between 1915 and 1918. Her book Gefangene Stimmen, Tonaufnahmen von Kriegsgefangenen aus dem Lautarchiv 1915 bis 1918 came out in 2019, followed this year by the English translation under the title Captured Voices. Together with Annette Hoffmann and Margit Börner, Britta Lange co-authored the book Sensible Sammlungen aus dem Anthropologischen Depot, released in 2011, and together with Annette Hoffmann and Regina Sarreiter, Was wir sehen, Bilder, Stimmen, Rauschen zur Kritik anthropometrischen Sammelns. One of her latest research projects was dedicated to animals as objects and focused especially on the ways through which zoos, aquariums, and collections in museums of natural history made those animals talk. Since her monograph on Captured Voices is accompanied by a CD with recorded voices from our university's sound archive, we will open up the conversation between Britta Lange and Lawrence Abu-Hamden by an overture from the recordings, and then pass the word to Lawrence Abu-Hamden for his talk. And I omit the title because I just learned that you changed it all the way. So please join me in welcoming Lawrence Abu-Hamden and Britta Lange.
Thank you so much for the invitation and the kind introduction. And we thought to begin to work with and to think about sound and especially voices today. And here I would introduce you very briefly and situate us in the institution where we all are in now and here, which is the Humboldt-Universität. And the 1810 founded Berlin University owns, as Ethel Matala said already, a collection of sound recordings initiated in 1915, the so-called Berliner Lautarchiv, or Berlin Sound Archive. The recordings of prisoners of war in German camps, 1,650 gramophone records were made between 1915 and 1918 by the Royal Prussian Phonographic Commission. These Berlin professors, coordinated by English teacher Wilhelm Dögen, had the task to produce samples of the spoken languages and dialects, the songs and music of as many people as possible in this very moment. To obtain discs that later should form a sound library and serve as mediums helping to learn a foreign language, the prisoners were asked to write down texts they knew very well and then to read them out into the funnel of the gramophone. For my book, I have chosen some recordings which do not contain only traditional text, but on which the speakers tell something about their biography and their emotions, and we don't know where these accounts are there. So they spoke about how they came into the European war, how they were brought to the camps, and what they thought of home. The concept of using the sound files in my book, developed together with Sebastian Schwesinger, is to make the act of listening audible. So in this case, my own listening of the old recordings. And you see me and Sebastian here adjusting the frequency of the shellac disc in the sound archive. And we had connected the turntable to normal speakers, and we recorded the old sounds with a notebook and simple microphones. So what you're listening to is you're listening to me taking out the old shellac disc from the envelope, putting it on the turntable, playing it, stopping it, and taking it back. I wish to let you listen to one example. Khote Singh, an Indian colonial soldier from Fatehpur, 29 years old, spoke into the funnel of the gramophone on 3rd January 1917 in the political prisoner of war camp in Wünsdorf. This is around 40 kilometers south of Berlin. In the room were the commissioner Wilhelm Dögen, the Indologist Heinrich Lüders, who hold a chair at this university at the time, the technician who made run the gramophone, and probably other prisoners. All of them were listening to Khote Singh. At 12:15, he recited in Hindi, his mother tongue, the text of a traditional song on Rama and Jatayu. Sebastian and I recorded me listening to Khote Singh's voice in the sound archive on 1st February 2017, 100 years and 1 month after the recording was made. But when we played it, a voice unknown to us came out of the speakers, a man's voice with a Berlin accent. We first thought it was a ghost, but then we understood that an interference was happening and perturbed our act of listening and recording.
चेतावनी भजन रघुवर कौशल्या के लाल मुनि जग रचाने वाले पहुँचे जनकपुरी दरबार लचाया सब भूपन करमान दिल में जरा नहीं अभिमान चौका धनुष तोड़ने वाले सीता जब गई रनवास एक मन में भई उदास 14 बरस लई बनवास अहिल्या केर तारने वाले रघुवर कौशल्या के लाल मुनि जग रचाने वाले कपट मृग बनो नीच में आय दशानन हरि जान की जाय जटाई कीनी युद्ध अघाय राम के ताज बनाने वाले रघुवर कौशल्या के लाल मुनि जग रचाने वाले दशानन छोड़ो पावक बान जटाई गिरोधरन परयान पीछे आए श्री भगवान जटाई को धाम पठाने वाले रघुवर कौशल्या के लाल मुनि जग रचाने वाले सिपाही छोटे सिंह जिला फतेहपुर गांव फौंडर सन 1914 की लड़ाई में मैं जर्मन में कैद हूँ। भाई बहुत तरह से रहता हूँ, जर्मन बादशाह बहुत आनंद से रखता है और जय हो जय हो जय हो।
Somehow, our simple recording system had turned into a radio that could receive sounds from outside. We assumed that we listened to the conversation of the policeman in front of Angela Merkel's home, so the Chancellor's apartment, which is right beside the sound archive. But we would only understand days later that police radio is, of course, encoded and could not be deciphered by our radio. We now guess that it was the walkie-talkies of the big construction site on the museum's island, right in front. What is more, to this recording is the speech act of Khote Singh, as in the end he leaves the written text and appropriates the room for himself. Without permission and without announcing it to the academics, he says his name and where he is from. Soldier, Khote Singh, district Fatehpur village, Kaundar. I am a prisoner in Germany from the war of 1914. Brother, I live with pride. The German king keeps me with great happiness, and jai ho, jai ho, jai ho, ha 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 ha. The impersonal mythological story is followed by the personal seizing of the word for self-description. Khote Singh broke the system established by the academics and used the moment to make an acoustic signature and to laugh. This uncanny threefold laughing follows a comment on the German king The laughter is a powerful sign of being alive and living with pride. The laughter as bare voice could hardly be transcribed or translated by Wilhelm Dugen. Instead, it urged the commissioner to explain it. Dugen notes with a pencil on an extra sheet, Khote Singh is laughing because he is happy about the good food, and the emperor will be happy if he hears this. This, I think, is an act of major disempowerment by Wilhelm Dugen, as he explains the raising of the voice in a laughter as joy and thankfulness. But if we think, for example, with Homi Bhabha's notion of colonial mimicry, we might state that Khote Singh imitated the colonial convention and the white and European demand for gratitude by laughing, and thereby producing colonial nonsense, even countersense. The laughter in its repetitions is a moment of disturbing and explosive empowerment for Khote Singh and the other Indian prisoners listening to him. He may have laughed precisely at the attempt to subdue his laughter. So this is a university collection we have here as a legacy, and I think we have to deal with it. And I personally chose to do it via listening, and I have always understood listening as something very personal, but also something very political. And I am very excited that you're here, Lawrence. And I'm very interested about maybe relations that could be made between the political listening and the private ear you're describing yourself as. So, welcome. Thanks.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for these also great introductory notes. It's really a big honor to be here, and thank you so much for inviting me. I'm gonna, I kind of changed what I was gonna say today because I sort of was provoked. The days before you're going to do something, you always kind of read again the blurb. And I was provoked by it in a positive way to sort of actually do something more tailored to the kinds of questions that were being asked in this abstract, specifically because it seemed to me that it was so relevant to a lot of the work I'd done, and particularly around a kind of chronology of sort of pre-digital voices, as Britta was discussing, but also like how that allows us to understand certain kinds of ways in which surveillance is operative today, and certain kinds of ways in which we can understand the digitization of the voice in its predecessors. And so what I'm going to do is kind of like start in 1925, then leap from 1925 to 1985, then to 1995, and then into our present situation. So, in Dayton, Tennessee, in the summer of 1925, the Scopes trial began. It's a federal criminal trial that welcomed the first ever live radio broadcast of a courtroom in history, and has been described as a contest entirely over ideas. It was also described as the trial of the century. I think that was a little premature in 1925, considering the trials we knew that came after this. It became informally known as the Scopes monkey trial, as it took to the dock a high school biology teacher, John Scopes, for violating the state's Butler Act, which meant that it was unlawful to teach evolution. When negotiating the radio broadcast of the trial, the local authorities in Dayton, WGN Radio, received the rights to rearrange the courtroom setup to accommodate the 3 microphones they needed. So the jury box was removed from the center of the chamber to make room for 3 central microphones. and that fed, as well as the radio loudspeakers on the courthouse lawn and in 4 public auditoriums around town. This act of rearranging the courtroom to accommodate the microphones shows how the microphones were not simply kind of passive receivers of the event, but kind of actively shaping those events. The microphones manipulated where people would sit, where the jury would sit, the volume people spoke at, the relationship of the judge and prosecution to the defense. And by changing these kind of long-standing conventions of the courtroom's interior architecture, the very first microphone in court represent a radical intervention into the nature through which justice was to be derived. And this is the first microphone there. You see it, that big, looks like a big telephone, but it's a microphone. Not only inside the courtroom did the introduction of the microphone alter the legal space. Through the radio, the trial found other sites to dwell in: domestic interiors, diners, and radio retailers. The vast extension of the space of the trial across America was central to its mode of operation. The radio audience were architecturally, because of the placement of the microphones, positioned as jurors and auditors of judgment. So, literally, the microphones took the place of the jury. The radio audience heard, many of them for the first time, how a US courtroom operates. What it was established was the bandwidth at which one's voice must perform for it to be heard in a juridical forum. First time you would ever sort of hear, unless you'd been involved directly, the way in which the kind of legal parlance function and the kind of the elocution necessary to be heard in such a forum. By inviting the radio audience to be the invisible jurors in the trial, the radio broadcasters made the law more accessible, its rules and boundaries more widely known, while simultaneously allowing its interior operation to pervade the intersubjective relationships in American society. So the medium of the law today is no longer radiophonic, but algorithmic and biometric. Yet we see the same demand made of these new technologies as were made of the very first microphone in court, and that is the expansion of the space of truth production. So that's really my kind of key argument here in response to the blurb, that in fact it's the same demands we keep asking of technology. If we look, essentially it's the same things that we're asking in 1925 that we're asking through the different things. So instead of to put into question the idea that digital analysis of voice and the emergence of deepfake and all these new kinds of technologies that are emerging are in fact a shift of paradigm, or did that actually happen all the way back in 1925? So beyond charting the history of the mediation of the trial or the technological expansion of the space of law, we see how wherever we probe the collaboration between the space of justice and new kinds of audio technology, be it in 1925 when a first microphone was used, or in 1984 with the implementation of audio recording machines in police interrogation rooms, the implications for the speaking subject and the legal conceptions of the human voice are transformative. And so for me, it's really this concern of, what are the implications of us as speaking subjects today? And this is why I really try to think very much about the sort of politics of listening. And although these are stories that are about the voice, it's much more about sort of how those voices are heard than the sort of classic argument of sort of attaining a voice or achieving a voice or having a voice. It's much more concentrated on the sort of structural nature of listening in such forums. So, as I mentioned, the other kind of big moment is in 1984, when the Police and Criminal Evidence Act, which was a major piece of legal reform in the United Kingdom, followed then by other countries, which I'll go into, of which Code E was seen as a solution to the rising number of complaints that the police were falsifying confessions and altering statements made during interviews. Because before audio recording machines were put into interviews, all statements were written down verbatim by police officers and signed off by the suspect. Before the introduction of this law, many complaints against the verbatim transcript had been made by police officers, were either that they were falsifying testimony and confessions, or had not understood what the suspect had or intended to say. These complaints were made with very little means to verify if they were legitimate or not in court, as it was one person's word against the word of a police officer. This law was implemented to end these kind of disputes, as there would be an audio recording of what had actually been said rather than a transcript made by a non-objective police officer. However, PACE, this law, did not end disputes about what was and wasn't said in police interviews. It rather multiplied them. The information stored in the voice pertained not only to a more accurate record of what was spoken, but a record of the speech itself. This allowed jurors and judges a potential counter-narrative. Sometimes the voice on the audio recording confirmed a narrative of events that could have been drawn from a written transcript, but sometimes the voice created its own more complex story, with its stresses, inflections, emotional tonality, class, and geographic origin. What purported to create a stronger signal, in fact, added more noise into the system of justice. And vocal noise became the next site of contest, as police quickly discovered that having a recording of a voice was not enough. They also needed experts to prove that the two recordings of the same voice matched each other, or to determine if an incriminating word or phrase could have been spoken with another intentionality, contained subtly within the event of its sounding. The audio record proved not to be a definitive defense against claims of police corruption, but an even more contentious object around which opposing parties struggled to form different narratives and debates in the courtroom. What was seemingly evident to the casual listener had to be subject to expert scrutiny in order to make the claims beyond reasonable doubt over a given voice. Therefore, audio recording of interview necessitated both the police and defense to reach to expert listeners in the form of university-accredited linguists, phoneticians, and philologists, to produce reports and testify about the idiosyncrasies of each of the spoken voices that were under investigation. This is how the recording of police interviews inadvertently created and expanded a new field, and with it a new epistemology based on speaker profiling, voice identification, voice prints, and through which the regional, ethnic, emotional, psychological, morphological, and lexical identities of any given speaker could be contested. Moreover, prior to this law, okay, let me just skip that actually. 1984, yeah. So, I mean, basically it also made mandatory acts, it made voluntary things mandatory. For example, if you were on a recording, like a wiretap, and you were heard arranging you were saying something incriminating, they would have to ask you to come in and give a voice sample, right? And you could say, no, I'm good. But after then, all they would need to do is to bring you in for kind of questioning, right? And as soon as they had you in there, you already had the sort of involuntary voice sample, which they could subject to analysis. So the introduction of this law in 1984 is therefore how the field of forensic listening was born. After the passing of PACE, forensic linguists was a field of expertise that suddenly was in great demand because of the necessity to provide expert testimony. The greater the capacity these experts had to make more solid claims, because this also gained momentum because it was a kind of exponential growth, because the more PACE continued, or the more the police interviews were recorded, the greater the capacity these experts had to make more solid claims, because the database of voices against which it could compare and analyze any given voice was growing with every new police interview conducted. So in 1986, the Essex Police newspaper reported in a 20-month period between April 1984 and January 1986, 8,423 taped interviews were carried out using approximately 29,000 cassette tapes. This effectively meant that within the first months of the enforcement of PACE, the United Kingdom had generated one of the largest voice archives in the world. A resource for the general study of linguistics like none other had been before it. And yet there were only a few forensic linguists who operated in dedicated laboratories of voice and sound analysis who qualified to access it. One of those people, and the kind of key, one of the kind of real people who were there in this kind of boom moment, was Peter French of J.P. French Associates. And he's the United Kingdom's most prominent forensic audio laboratory, though I'm kind of trying to challenge that. Yeah, so Peter French told me that whereas up to that point I had a trickle of work coming in, all of a sudden it was as though there had been a thunderstorm and it started raining cassette tapes. And contemporaneously, laws similar to PACE began to be put into legislation across the world. For example, in Australia in 1986, it was ruled that all confessions made to the police had to be audio recorded. And I think this is a really interesting story because it involved a case of an Aboriginal speaker who basically what was going on is there was widespread confessions being kind of fitted up by Australian police of Aborigines and Aboriginal speakers, and basically there was this really inspiring linguist called Diana Eads, and she was saying, when I saw the confessions, I was shocked at how different it was from the way that actually these people spoke, and that's what alarmed her to the idea that actually these confessions were being fitted up. You know, they were just writing them out and arresting people. And locking people in prison, unjustly. So Eads then solicited hours of tape recordings of these people speaking, and studied the way that the Aboriginal people from that part of Queensland spoke English in order to compare this data with the police transcript and to show that this is not really how these people spoke. So how is this a verbatim transcript? And so I guess, my point is that, we can always look at these things, and as we move through the kind of examples that I'm going to give today, as a kind of force of control, domination over the voice, a kind of Orwellian idea of like surveillance, that our voices are kind of becoming increasingly more pressure, and more listeners and more ears are kind of falling on them by the minute. We can also think, as these people did at the time, that this was really acts of actual kind of greater inclusion, right? That in many ways, for the Aboriginal speakers, this was a moment where they could actually kind of receive a kind of justice. That the sort of moment, their whole voice could actually be allowed into the system, and they weren't being ventriloquized. It was a kind of radical shift. And so I think I kind of want you to sort of bear that in mind, not to sort of sow any false hope, but as we move through this, the kind of narrative I'm going to tell is not exactly the one in which you often hear this a kind of bleaker narrative around surveillance, and as we move through, it should become more clear. Am I good with time? Are we good with time? Yeah, we have a lot of time? Okay, because I have a lot more to say. An early example of what Peter French he'd do most in his work is called disputed utterance cases, right? And this is a description of one of them. He said he was asked by the police to analyze an audio cassette of a police interview with a British man who had a Punjabi accent. The man was suspect in a case in which his lover was suddenly died next to him in bed. The man denied that they had had any sexual interaction before he died, and is heard saying on the police interview tape, "After one cough, he died." The police, however, heard the man say, "After wank off, he died," and used this to perceive inconsistencies in his testimony to charge him as a suspect in the lover's death. The foundation of the suspicion against him was that he had initially said there was no sexual interaction, and then changed the story during the interview by pronouncing what the police perceived to be a contradictory statement. So French's expert testimony then pertained to the specific qualities of Punjabi British accent. French was able to identify to the court that there was a barely perceptible break between the words one and cough, rather than the break that the police officer claimed to have heard between k and off. And so, French's testimony contradicted the perception of the police and confirmed that the man had in fact said one cough. The outcome of this case hinged on a kind of microsecond break in the flow of this man's speech. And by proving the existence of a small enough silence between one and cough, French convinced the police that this man was telling the truth, and as there was no other evidence of the suspect being involved in the death of his lover, eventually this expert testimony led to the release of the suspect. The cases like this are highly illustrative about the way in which the inclusion of the audio record, the voice itself, become treated like a crime scene, right? They also, of course, show you forms of kind of racist and homophobic kind of acts of listening that are constantly kind of, falling on this voice, and the ways in which actually some of this work was happening to sort of protect those more vulnerable voices. And so the voice is kind of treated like a crime scene in which crucial trace of the criminal event is stored. In the above example, the audio recorded testimony becomes both witness testimony and a material trace of the event to someone's death. Determining from the audio what was said becomes equivalent, or rather stands in the place of a kind of DNA analysis of, traces at the crime scene. If it was, the manner of this contradiction is startling because it shows us that the ways in which, once recorded in a police interview, our voices are no longer our own. It was no longer possible for the man to speak to what he had himself said. His voice was now an article of evidence in the hands of experts to identify. And the treatment of speech is definitive of testimony in this kind of era, this kind of post-1984 era, in which the boundaries between what constitutes testimony and what constitutes evidence is becoming much less defined. So what constitutes a kind of account and the sort of voice as a kind of material trace of that account. Right? So the voice both kind of carry testimony and is itself a kind of burden of that moment and that kind of scene. And these boundaries between the voice as a kind of carrier of testimony and a source of evidence would continue to blur as we move from the mid-80s to the mid-90s and the advent of digital audio. And so before we all carried our own personal microphones, wiretapping had to be a lot more creative. For the CIA or FBI, bugging a room largely involved hiding microphones in lamps, light fixtures concealed in wall orifices, plug sockets, switches, suspending microphones into rooms using the wiring and piping cavities. These were all excellent technique at concealing microphones, but the recordings were horrible. One word in every 20 escaping the fog of infrastructural sound, half-completed sentences buried in the sound of water disturbing, water being flushed in toilets or whatever would happen, while other key information swallowed in thick electrical interference. The sound of the home that we have become so intuitively accustomed to tuning out with our naked ears were being unsurpassably magnetized to the tape surface. The background had come to overwhelm the foreground, necessitating new techniques and technologies to return the background to its rightful place. So the incessant buzz of electrical interference was one of the easier artifacts to peel away. A loud hum of 50 Hz in Europe or 60 Hz in the US could be theoretically filtered out with ease. And so hypothesized Dr. Katalin Grigoras, a forensic audio expert hired to enhance wiretap recordings. And in 1991, Grigoras was working to enhance audio quality of analog tape recordings for legal use. And his initial attempts to filter these sounds out by applying a filter at 50 Hz, the frequency at which the electricity buzzed, were unsuccessful. Small electrical noises still penetrated the recording randomly between 49 and 51 Hz. And in February 2014, I conducted a telephone interview with Grigoras in which he explained, "This is how I first found the ENF is not at 50 Hz. This is something random around 50 Hz. So I built in the lab an adaptive filter that is able to follow and detect the ENF, the electrical noise, and subtract it. The idea of ENF as something not random, not predictable was clear somewhere in my mind. This is an important thing. So what we assumed was 50 hertz was not. It was kind of bouncing everywhere, this sound. The adaptive noise filter that Grigoris built to clean this oscillating electrical noise off a recording was also by necessity mapping the random fluctuations of this buzz. In the days of analog recordings, this kind of song of electricity was meaningless, because as the technical moving parts of the tape recorder moved at fluctuating unsmooth speed, it meant that each machine added an oscillating electrical noise and its small own variations in pitch. So you couldn't really use it because the tape itself was moving mechanically, right? So it was kind of also adding its own variations in pitch. However, given that digital recording relies not on mechanical circuits, but rather encodes audio into a sequence of symbols, and the pattern of oscillation of the electrical buzz was captured without the extra speed fluctuations and distortions added by the analog machine. Therefore, any two digital recorders, regardless of their brand, size, and voltage, would record the buzz in almost exactly the same way. So two digital recordings made at the same time but at two different locations on the same electricity grid would have the same exact sound, the same exact random pattern of oscillation of electricity. Grigoris then kind of had his eureka moment that because the pattern of fluctuation is so random and the probability of that same pattern repeating over, let's say, a 10-second piece of audio, then by listening to the buzz of the audio recording, it should be possible to deduce exactly when a recording was made. So the recording was full of hum and noise. And this is him again, this is Grigoris. I first knew that how to extract, and then I realized that it's not predictable. Unique variations can be used as an indication of or authentication of time, but we needed a database. No electrical company was able to record with high enough quality the ENF, so I said, okay, I'll build my own database. And this is how I started in '96, just recording the buzz in his home. And this is also like very pedantic, but things that I'm really interested in because, you know, just from this kind of like tuning into these little noises and buzzes and clicks, whole kind of worlds open, whole ways in which we're policed and controlled kind of change. Grigoris developed a system for the better eradication of unwanted noise. And while getting to know that noise closely in order to eradicate it, he understood that it was not noise at all, but rather a song of sorts. The melody of this buzz did not follow the logic of any musical motif. Rather, its strange song will almost never repeat itself. And it's this kind of total unpredictability, each 5-second phrase unique to the next, paradoxically made it easy to decipher as a unique timestamp. So he kind of used this as a kind of digital clock, right? So that, and he said, I started step by step. I made 2 simultaneous recordings in the same office. And this is when he was testing to see if the buzz was consistent. He started by making 2 different recordings and 2 different plugs. Then 2 different parts of Romania. Then on a European scale, because actually one massive grid. So actually the same buzz that was in Romania was the same one that was in Germany, right? So this is the same buzz. So he kind of, from his electrical socket and buzz, he could time and authenticate any recording that was made across the kind of European continental electrical grid. So it's a kind of like, and this is like also precede Romania being in the European Union, or yeah. So this is kind of like it's the grid, the infrastructure kind of precedes these. What do I want to say with this? What was that useful for? For legal reasons, Grigoris could not share with me details of the cases he's worked on, though he did summarize a few circumstances where his analysis had been effective. Firstly, the timestamp of a mains buzz can be used as a way of for someone to prove where they were at a specific time. The recording of the buzz can work like an alibi, so that the police accuse someone of being present at a crime, and they have a recording of themselves somewhere else with a conflicting timestamp. They can say that they were there. Other thing is you can prove, let's say you have in corruption cases, someone is saying something that they shouldn't know before an event is publicly known, you have the ability to say, in fact, they did know before. And mostly they used it to authenticate if editing happened, because let's say if he has a consistent time, you know, between minute this and minute that the buzz did this kind of thing, but you know, they're cuts that don't actually exist in his database, then he knows that that's a kind of fabricated time, and the edit made a kind of new, or the edit was an edit that didn't actually exist, that it's omitting parts of time. You could say, okay, this happened at minute something, and this, then there's a break, and the buzz picks up again at minute. So we're missing kind of a key part of a recording. And all of this was extremely important for the kind of growing amount of noise and surveillance that were coming through. And you know, in 2012 there was a case in the UK where arms dealers were convicted using this ENF analysis. And what was interesting about that coming forward in the trial and becoming part of public record is it was the first time we knew that actually the British police, which were not on the European continental grid, were doing that in their labs. So it was the first time we understood that actually the British police were recording this same buzz, and they'd kind of stolen Grigoris's idea. And so I also stole Grigoris's idea. I built this thing called the hummingbird clock, which is a kind of, you know, acknowledgement that the British police had this recording, but in fact it's a kind of national buzz. It's a kind of national anthem, this buzz, and you know, you can get it from any plug. So I started my own database in the UK, a kind of like people's database that could be used So I also, it became part of a kind of public artwork also. Here in Liverpool, it's this binoculars that sit in the center of the, outside the courts actually, and through the binoculars you can see the kind of time on the town hall, and there's a kind of little text that allow people to go to the website, submit recordings, and sort of like a idea of making this a public sculpture again to reclaim this kind of national space, this kind of public space of the buzz. So as is demonstrated in this example, the opportunities opened up by the advent of digital audio technology in the mid to late 90s radically increased the capacities and resolution at which forensic audio could be detected and analyzed. The more that digital audio was used, the more the field of forensic audio was able to radically increase its sonic scope and to listen more deeply into the background of the noises that surround us. Another catalyst for this was that digital audio technology allowed several emergency telephone response centers to record and store emergency phone calls they received without, you know, amassing another. So this meant that another sort of archive started to be created, and this time a digital one, not one that needed 29,000 cassettes in 2 months or whatever the Essex police recorded. They wanted to record the emergency calls for 2 reasons. Both rapidly increase the necessity of forensic listeners. Firstly, the response centers were trying to catch prank callers, but in that case, they would ask the forensic listeners to match those voices. Secondly, the event could be heard in the background of the noises of a call. When the police realized they could hear the remnants of a crime taking place in the emergency phone recording, they turned to these linguists who were really voice specialists, like Peter French, and who had first contracted to listen and profile voices. However, here, rather than asking the forensic linguist to listen to the voice on the tape, or the voice of the person calling the emergency phone call, they're asking them to listen to the sounds in the background, to listen past the voice speaking to the operator, and to identify the sounds behind them. For the first time, people trained in linguistics and the sonics of the human voice were applying their skills to gunshots, architectural acoustic environments, electrical buzzes, and other noises that could provide information about the nature of a crime. This is how linguists began to expand their audible horizons to include not only the speech of the human voice, but also the speech of the body, the architecture, ammunition, and infrastructure. And a direct correlation can be drawn between each incremental legal incorporation of audio technology and the increasingly elements in our sonic and acoustic world that become legally audible or legitimate. With the introduction of the tape recorded in the police interview, there was an expansion of the words to the voice. Right? With the implementation of digital audio technology, we see an expansion from profiling the voice of a caller to defining and archiving a new lexicon of sounds from the world behind that voice. Then, at this present juncture, the introduction of algorithmic audio analysis, and this is now from the mid-2000s till now, it's basically a vast archive of voices, buzz, and other sounds amassed by forensic listeners since the mid-80s could be input into a database and cross-checked and analyzed, along with new sounds coming in, all within a matter of minutes. So the possibility to algorithmically make forensic comparisons between sounds and voices sharpened the possibility to distinguish between the sounds of the increasingly noisy world around us. What happened to the voice in the mid-80s, the process by which the sound of the speech could be legally considered speech itself, can now be applied to almost any sound. Each of these new technologies, beginning with the first microphone used in court, expand the resolution of legal audibility and with it pull sounds out of the background into the foreground, whether it is specific phonemes that constitute someone's accent or the buzz of a streetlight behind them, where they stood at the time of the recording. Forensic listening increasingly hones in on and expands our audible horizons. And if I have time, I will give one last example of this kind of algorithmic era. And that's ShotSpotter. And this really, for me, captures the kind of political tensions and conflicts that emerge with the expansion of these frontiers. So in December 2014, new audio evidence emerged that captured the moment when unarmed teenager Michael Brown was shot to death in Ferguson, Missouri. The audio was submitted by an anonymous man who incidentally caught the moment of the shooting as he was recording and sending a personal voice message from his phone using Glide. This is the transcript of that recording. "You are pretty, 6 gunshots. You're so fine. Just going over some of your videos, gunshot. How, gunshot, can, gunshot, I, gunshot, forget, gunshot." This is the...
"You are pretty. You're so fine. Just going over some of your videos. How could I forget?"
In the background of this recording, it is audible that Brown's killer, a police officer by the name of Darren Wilson, fired his gun 10 times. Of the 10 gunshots that were fired, the most rudimentary information that Dr. Robert Schoen, one of the key expert listeners in this case and the founder of ShotSpotter, was able to deduce from the recording. His analysis of the gunshots focused mostly on the echo they created. Using the impulse sounds of the shots and their reflection off nearby walls, he was able to define the space around the shooter. As each echo of each shot had the same exact delay in time between the original and the echo, it was possible to conclude that the murderer was stationary and was not moving while he was firing the shots. So if he was moving, that echo would kind of increase or decrease in time. The evidence corroborated several eyewitness testimonies and was also key to denying the veracity of contradicting accounts that Darren Wilson was moving towards Michael Brown as he was firing. So a strange technicality necessary in making a claim of self-defense. Although Darren Wilson had shot an unarmed man in the head repeatedly, these echoes, accompanied by a legal narrative, that provided he was acting in self-defense and therefore was not convicted by the grand jury. So ShotSpotter, which is what Dr. Robert Schoen founded and created, the same guy who gave evidence in the Brown case, is a gunshot detection and echolocation system that worked by installing microphones throughout neighborhoods. When these microphones detect a loud bang, they automatically triangulate where the sound is coming from. The loud impulse is uploaded and automatically analyzed against a database of bang sounds to quickly verify if the sound registered is indeed a gunshot. If it decides that the sound is gunfire rather than a firecracker or an engine backfiring, it sends the location of the gunfire to the police department. In 2014 alone, ShotSpotter detected and processed over 61,000 recorded gunshot incidents, many of which were later used as evidence in court. This system is now installed in 80 neighborhoods across the US and is currently expanding to South Africa. The rhetoric of ShotSpotter, when it is sold to municipal authorities in the US, suggests that communities affected by gun crime are composed of people who had been unresponsive to gun crime and who failed to report more than 80% of the gunshots that they heard. So what was key in the implementation of this technology was that gunshots were going unreported, right? So they needed a system that would replace these insensitive ears with law-abiding microphones to be able to algorithmically detect the 80% of previously unreported shots. So our sensors, Sean says, microphone sensitivity is almost identical to what is on a cell phone or a speakerphone. However, the capacity for human hearing is in general much more sensitive and adapted to interpreting sounds than a cell phone microphone placed on a rooftop. Therefore, the issue is not that people don't hear the shots and the microphones do, but rather that people hear the shots and choose not to report them to the police. And of course, the reason why they choose not to report them to police is exactly the kind of reasons why we see Michael Brown being shot 10 times. Essentially, if we just look at some of the deaths, in the last 10 years, you could deduce that it is often in the police who are firing the gunshots they are hearing, and even if it is not, the repercussions of calling the police could lead to more violence and unnecessary loss of life. Schoen, although attempting to use his technology and expertise to reduce gun crime, has never analyzed a gunshot that has led to the conviction of a police officer, but has worked on 2 cases in which his acoustic evidence showed that police officers were using legitimate force when killing and maiming young black men. Schoen's evidence is based on a 0.136 millisecond time delay between each gunshot and its first echo. However, there is another time delay on that same recording which is completely omitted from Schoen's report, and this is the 1.8 second time delay in which the utterance of the voice in the foreground is interrupted by the volley of 6 gunshots. This 1.8 second time delay in which the man's voice in the foreground is interrupted, right? So he's the 1.8 seconds between "you're pretty" and "you're so fine." There's 6 gunshots in that 1.8 seconds. This short pause is an only acknowledgement of the gunfire as he waits for it to subside so he can carry on his message. This pause lets us hear that he can hear the gunshots, he is interrupted by the gunshots, but does not verbally acknowledge them. So we're kind of hearing something quite strange. A sort of desire and affection is underscored by the sounds of brutal violence. And when this anonymous recording was broadcast on news networks and played back to the grand jury, a figure ground shift was being asked of the audience not to listen to the voice. They said, ignore what he's saying. Listen only to the shots in the background. Listen past it, the sound. The voice, especially its pregnant pause, was pushed to the background. And this is this pregnant pause is a kind of, everything's in that pause. It's not only I'm not trying to say it's desensitization, but it's certainly not one which is alarmed enough to call the police or wants to call the police, right? So you're kind of hearing that unresponsiveness. And I think that's very important. As he does not respond by alerting the emergency services, we hear the sound of the distrust of the police. We hear, as we may not have known or not, as he may have known or not, were at that, the police who he may have not known were the ones at that moment outside committing the murder of an unarmed citizen. So the pause in speech, his silence fused with the gunshots, provides us an extraordinary example of the meeting of quotidian and spectacular forms of institutionalized violence. in which we hear the desensitized voice or the knowing the problems of sensitivity to sort of act on such a sound coincide with the killing of the police. So we hear a voice of a young black man ignoring this sound of gunshots, or the killing of the police gunshots of another young black man. We can hear upon this more sensitive listening that is captured in the interplay between Brown's death and this man's pause is not simply the murder of one unarmed black teenager, but the sound of institutionalized racist violence in the US. By listening to and amplifying this gap, as well as those of the delays between the shots, we can hear the echoes of the individual murder while also expanding the range of our audibility to encompass a quotidian violence perpetrated not against a single victim, but an entire community. So when ShotSpotter was first installed, many news articles in The Guardian, New York Times appeared with their main focus on the concerns that ShotSpotter could constitute a Fourth Amendment violation. And that's warrantless search and seizure of public sounds. They decried a pervasive method of surveillance that could be used to record private conversations and amassing a vast sound archive, again, available of all kinds of security applications. Yet ShotSpotter says the entire system is intentionally designed not to permit live listening of any sort. Human voices do not trigger ShotSpotter sensors. So I think it's a kind of lazy sort of act of critique to say that rather than to see this as the media did, an insidious method to capture our voices under the guise of policing gun crime, I take ShotSpotter at its word, and following my arguments above, the company are actually not interested in human voices, and maybe that's something more frightening than the way that we consistently think that we are the total subject of this kind of surveillance, right? That it's our voices as kind of bearers of our subject which are they're trying to secretly listen to in the guise of gunshots. In fact, maybe they don't care about our voice, and that's really the takeaway. They don't care about this 80% of people who are not calling. They're not able to listen to these silences, these gaps. They're not able to adequately hear our voice, and nor are they interested in it. And there's a correlation here that suggests that the more these technologies can probe deeper into our voices and our environments, the less our voices and circumstances are actually being heard. These technologies do not always represent a kind of Orwellian version of surveilled society where everything we say is overheard, but rather as a shift in the fundamental concept of what constitutes speech. And it's moving further and further away from a subject's verbal account of itself, as I've tried to show consistently through these examples. A call to privacy may not then be the best strategy for the contestation of ShotSpotter surveillance, and it does not adequately address how ShotSpotter listens. So this talk has outlined numerous examples of established and emerging audio technologies designed for legal and investigative purposes to document the tensions and conflicts that emerge within the expansion of the frontiers of listening and its implication for the attention given to the foreground and background of an audio recording. As I have highlighted, such tensions between foreground and background need to be approached with caution and sensitivity. On the one hand, a sensitivity for those voices and silences that are subsequently unheard. On the other, for the inner workings of the technological principles that codify these listening practices into law. Because the implications for the speaking subject need not be considered as purely negative. The expansion of these technologies beyond the capacities for human hearing play a part in an exclusionary process where human vocal agency is being transformed and in the process is losing some of its political potency. Although you could argue that political potency of voices is quite particularly distributed. Yet at the same time, and by the same means through which these technologies expand the horizons of the audible, they produce new forms of inclusion where sounds previously designated as noise or silence become able to speak. So this talk has kept its sights on the moments in which such transformations occur, and argue that by paying close attention to precisely what is at stake in these shifts, we can transform the means of our contestation to them. So rather than falling back on the languages of the law that preceded these new abilities to listen, let's say Fourth Amendment or free speech or these kind of things, we need to be able to listen at the fringes of human speech and human sonic perceptibility too. We must learn this new legal parlance. Rather than foreclosing the possibility of an electrical hum to speak, we should ourselves be learning how to speak mains buzz. That is, to speak back with the same intensity and expanded context in which our voices are now being heard and our world surveyed. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Lawrence, for this lecture and this very expanded talk with a lot of examples and over a span of more than, I think, 5-6 decades coming up to the present. You had this expression or this term of the forensic listening. And do you think it became very clear what you mean by that, showing the examples? Do you think it also had impact on something you could call forensic speaking? Meaning, as it was known that speech was recorded by the police and justice, did this recording and the knowledge of people that their speech would be listened to in the recordings, did it also change the way of speaking? I think you touched it on the level of content, because we all know that we would tell stories in a different manner when we are recorded, maybe than not. Maybe you could elaborate a bit on that, but also I wondered if forensic listening maybe also changed human voice in its physical qualities. I mean, do you have evidence on that it changes the voice in pitch or in,
I wish it changed. I mean, I kind of wish it changed, but I tell you why I say that, because I think that's exactly the kind of thing I'm sort of arguing for, that we need to respond in ways which are not in a kind of conservative or isolationist kind of practice. But unfortunately, I think we kept the same. And I think that's my problem. And, you know, I think the best way to answer your question is that now you know that your phone is listening to you all the time. Did you change the way you speak? Probably not, right? It's actually kind of alarming that we didn't change the way we speak, considering how much we know, right? And we've all now had these experiences where if we have Instagram on the phone and we're talking about Croatia, you're going to see the holiday in Croatia. This happened to me the other day. So, you know, you're going to see an advert for that. Or you're talking about a bag or a shoe, right? I mean, this is actually happening all the time. So in a way, it's kind of alarming that it didn't have this effect. But what I'm arguing for is maybe the question of the artifact to be changed. So exactly so, you know, my counter-analysis to Robert Schoen's is we need to be hearing that 1.8 seconds of silence. The same 1.8 seconds that he was analyzing the gunshots, so actually sort of understand that. So again, sort of like try to show what else could be considered acts of speaking, right? And so sort of take the kind of intensity of listening at its word.
Yeah, thank you. And I was very interested in this idea, of course, of the archive, which is being created by these technologies. And maybe you could let us know a little bit how you as an artist, a scientist, or can work with these archives, and what happens if you take out a recording out of one of these police or justice archives and you begin to work with it? What does it change and what does it mean to transfer these recordings to a different space and to ask different questions?
Well, I think each kind of database, if you want, that we're collecting, or the kind of counter database, is doing a different thing according to what it's sort of what kind of questions it's asking. It will look a specific way. It will be accessible in a specific way, depending on sort of the sort of politics it's molded by, or the kind of reaction it's taking to certain kinds of listening that are active. So yeah, I mean, as I sort of tried to say, sometimes it's about reclaiming this space. And so for example, with the sort of databasing of the mains hum, it's to sort of show that there's ways that this can just be something that we all have actual access to, this kind of buzz, if we sort of tune into it. And so sort of like a reclamation of that. In other contexts, it's been, I mean, each one quite different. Yeah, I don't want to take up a lot of time to sort of describing each one, but I think that's the answer to your question.
Yeah, I think it's always the beginning of an answer, because, as you said, it has to be looked at in a very specific situation.
I mean, actually, I will say something kind of interesting that happened recently. So I did this really large project, and it doesn't concern the voice. I'm not talking about it now, but it's kind of the last 2 years totally consumed me, which is about mapping and making the first interactive and searchable database of Israeli military aircraft that come into Lebanon. And it's the first time then anyone really had a sense of the scale of this thing, right? So it's like 22,000 jets in the last 15 years. The combined flight time of those jets is 8.5 years. So it means for more than half of the last 15 years there's been a drone, hostile kind of aircraft in the sky. They create a kind of pressure. It's also it's a kind of sonic intensity that builds up. But the point is that then this archive, which is put into the world, which is kind of course, trying to do a lot of different things, but mostly activate that one discussion and provide context for it, is now being used in Ukraine for another kind of work by another people entirely. I learned this the other day. They're using the sounds that I've gathered. This now a huge library of 400 videos of planes in the sky, drones in the sky, to identify what they're hearing above them in Ukraine. So it's kind of interesting that you never, once you sort of put a database in the world, and this is kind of a little bit what I'm describing in each of these other cases, where sort of the intention behind creating an archive is one thing, and then it starts to quickly transform. And that was certainly the case, I think, in the 80s. I don't think they had imagined they would create this kind of monster, but they did. Yeah. So I think, yeah, they're monsters. You never know how ugly they are.
And they create new ones.
They create new monsters. Exactly.
Right. Thank you. I would be happy to open the floor for discussion also for the audience. I think we have, you all have so many ideas. You have listened to a lot of sounds and pieces, so please feel invited to have questions and comments. Yes, please.
Yeah, thank you so much for your talk. It's hard to formulate a question. It was really powerful what you shared, and a lot of memories were coming for me because I lived many years in New York, and so I was thinking about my own experiences of hearing gunshots or interaction between police violence and communities. Especially the last example that you shared resonated a lot. I was thinking in the end statement you made, you said we need to be able to hear at the fringe of speeches, and I was wondering if you think that maybe art has the potential where we can intervene beyond the field of justice, since you seem to be working at this intersection. Is there maybe where we can move forward? It's a little broad, sorry, I don't know.
No, it's a very good question. Just need to think about it. I mean, I think what art is kind of, one thing about kind of art education, which I think is useful, is that it kind of teaches you that everything is a space of significance, right? So like, let's say you have to think about the cable that's going into the TV, if you're going to show it or not, if you're going to cover the little Samsung logo or not, right? So like, everything, you kind of taught that everything means something, and it's not, you know, that the whole kind of thing comes together to and I think sometimes that kind of mode of attention of caring about things that you're not supposed to care about, you're not, you don't, or to imagine that everything is constantly communicating in its own little way. I think those are sort of skills that we can kind of like apply to thinking about sort of given political conditions, status quo, you know, minutiae of the status quo in a way that I think is important to unpick at all times. Because of course, as we know, the status quo is not just like this thing that sits there, but is held together with great force of violence, right?
Yeah. Please.
Thank you very much for the fascinating talk. I'm very interested in the relationship between looking and listening. And I was wondering, as you were mentioning at the beginning, these changes of spatial dimensions of the legal space and the visibility of sound also, if you would say that it is developing towards an invisibility mostly, and also how this maybe relates to your own work, because I was very fascinated by the hummingbird clock, because what you see is so monotonous and it's just the time passing, and the sound is the changing aspect. So maybe you could expand a little on this relationship between visibility and audibility.
Yeah, I mean, I've expanded on that in other works quite a lot, because, you know, sometimes what emerges visibly, like let's say in the work I did to analyze the 2014 killing of 2 teenagers by an Israeli border guard. He shot 2 Palestinian teenagers, and the Israeli border force claimed that he was using rubber bullets. And that he didn't kill them, but you know, you could hear the difference. Well, eventually I could prove that in fact from the sound of the shots it was live ammunition, it was not rubber bullets. And it's a very small distinction in sort of sound, because a rubber bullet doesn't break the sound barrier, so that you don't have this kind of crack in the high frequencies. But otherwise, because when you fire a rubber bullet, you're still firing a blank round. It sounds very similar, right? Especially if you have the adapter on the end, and you know, to fire the thing. So my point is this: that I could, it's kind of like whole layers of sort of seeing and hearing, and what was inaudible to me was in fact visible, right? When I kind of visualized the sound, I could start to see that crack. I couldn't hear it, but then, if you looked at the way the crowd behaved, mostly, you know, kids, you could see that they could tell the difference of the sound of the shot like that. And that they would move in an incredibly different way when it was the sound of a rubber bullet and when it was the sound of a live ammunition. And so what was interesting is that the visibility of the incident and the sort of looking at the way people were listening rather than looking at the sound, was telling me of a kind of gap in my experience, right? That in fact, the so-called expert couldn't actually tell the difference. and that those people who were kind of had developed a kind of expertise were also not really invited into the sort of question of that the sort of exploration of that justice. And it's not only a question of inviting them; they also kind of refuse it, right, actively as a kind of mode of resistance. And also, it became articulate of the ways in which that firing or concealing of a live ammunition within of the kind of legitimate, less lethal space of the rubber bullet was happening much more than this one isolated incident, because how would you develop such an acute kind of sensitivity to it? So that kind of reaction started, you know, so the whole kind of layers of what was visible, what was audible, each one of those kind of meant something politically. It both kind of undermined my position in a kind of productive way, you know, and also started to speak about a kind of structural violence way beyond just this one incident. And yeah.
Are there more questions from the audience or comments?
Thank you so much for your talk. I'm still thinking about how you develop this specific sensitivity of listening. I understand quite well that people who have to struggle for survival, right? Because depending on deciphering the sound is the question of life and death, right? Are experts who do possess this kind of lexicon. You mentioned a lexicon to read sounds. How do the linguists train to read it? This is to acquire that lexicon and be able to complete it seems to me much more difficult. How can you learn it? How can you train it if you're not exposed to everyday situations like in the US where you are trained by everyday life?
No, I mean, I think it's about understanding certain kinds of methodologies, right? What kinds of noises tell you what kinds of things. And I think it's just about sort of like practice. And as I kind of tried to illustrate that, what was interesting for me is the shift when it turns digital. All these people are suddenly, who are just like linguists, suddenly start becoming ballistic experts. And so, you know, over time, the more they're kind of speaking to the police, the more they're getting this kind of flood of cassette tapes, and the more these archives are developing, it's a kind of natural kind of expansion of those horizons of what's possible in each one. So I think it's like years of practice. And, you know, people like Peter French would say that he spends 3 working days on one word. You know, it's just like, so imagine that. I mean, that's like more wild than what like Terry Riley was doing in New York in the 70s. And it's like, imagine like 3 words or one, you go crazy. But yeah, I mean, then I think then there's something else I've tried to focus on, which is the sort of latter, which is more sort of vernacular or forms of expertise that emerge through certain kind of political conditions, like the one I just mentioned. But also the one that was really important was for the Saidnaya case in the Syrian prison. Syrian regime prison, and there, you know, what you had a very clear performance of was what Primo Levi describes in the camp in his experience. He say that to witness take on as elemental need as drinking water, as eating food, right? So to kind of witness was to survive. And to cast yourself in the place of the kind of witness to come was as important as other kind of bodily needs, right? Just the basics of survival, right? And so I think we can really see it there, right? That this sort of intensity at which they were listening was kind of itself a kind of artifact of the intensity of the need to survive, or the kind of the intensity of the threat to life, or that they were also experiencing and living through.
Is there maybe a last question or comment? If not, may I address you something very broad, because we still have, I think, even in this very expanded possibilities of technologies and manipulation and everything, we still have this idea that the voice is something very personal, and it is always tied to notions of authenticity and personality. Do you see that fading, or do you see, like in other cases, rather an affirmation? Or what happens to this idea of voice and authenticity?
I mean, personally, I think the voice is the last place we should be looking for authenticity. And this is like something I've also tried to argue. I think the voice, it's itself a technology. The way I'm talking to you now is not how I'm going to talk to you later in the restaurant. I mean, and I think, you know, it's just, we need to sort of, I personally am desperate to kind of break that relation between subjecthood and voice. And I think it's really, you know, we are continually reinventing ourselves through our voice rather than sort of tied to some kind of originary being through it. And I think all the work I've done over the last decade and whatever has you know, reaffirmed that for me. I also grew up not ever thinking the voice was sort of somehow authentic. I'm like, my father is like a crazy code switcher, like crazy. Like he literally just changes how he's like almost comical. Like if he's speaking to this person, he speaks like that. Speaking to that person, he just switch it all the time. So I kind of like, you know, it's pretty interesting to know that you're different people with different people. And some of the work has been to sort of argue for the necessity of that, to sort of just show how ungovernable the voice is, rather than to show it as some kind of birth or some kind of substitute for a birth certificate or a passport or some kind of documentation. So yeah. I hope it fades if it's not fading.
Thank you so much for this statement we might all take with us in the rest of the evening. And before thanking Lawrence, I have the pleasure to announce that this was the last Mossel lecture for this year, but this series continues in 2023 on 19th January. And very exciting that Marcel Bayer will be here in conversation with Lothar Müller, and the title of his talk will be Die Stimme bleibt fremd, die Stimme bleibt in Bewegung bis Gütersloh. So thank you all for being here and discussing with us, and have a nice evening and a nice way home. And thank you so much, Lawrence, for this talk and the questions.